I see that our participants are starting to join us. I'm just going to hold off for one more minute before we really get rolling so that everyone can join us for our webinar today. All right, I see participants still trickling in, but I think in the interests of time, we should probably get rolling. So thanks everyone for being here. This is a great way to spend a sunny Wednesday afternoon with each other. Hopefully we'll all head out to the fresh air after this. But welcome to Solve Climate by 2030, 4 Steps for Climate Action, which is a webinar hosted by the University of Waterloo's Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change, also known as IC3, and the Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Energy, WISE. My name is Sarah Birch. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. My research and practice focuses on sustainability transitions in communities, climate change, adaptation and mitigation, so all sorts of climate change responses. And I'm also one of the very many lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, which is the United Nations scientific body working on the state of the art of climate change science. So I'm thrilled to be moderating this, this panel today. It's not about me, it's about all of the faces that you see on your screen and all of your questions and answers. So I'm looking forward to a really great afternoon. So by way of a bit of backstory and context here, this webinar is part of the Solve Climate by 2030 series that's led by Bard College in the United States. The series is an international movement educating post-secondary and high school students about the importance for everyone taking action, big or small, in order to put us on the path to solving climate change by 2030. Our webinar is one of over 100 global events that will engage over 10,000 students in taking climate change action. So we are part of a grand tradition and a broader network of activities, which is really exciting. Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to provide a little bit of space to reflect on the land on which we live and work and the relationships that we're building here. At the University of Waterloo, where we live, work, and learn, we are on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River is known as the Haldimand Tract, land promised to the Haudenosaunee. Reflecting on this in the context of this event, I think is particularly potent, for me at least, because it's clear that climate change is a manifestation of a distorted and extractive relationship with the land and with people who have cared for it for generations. The University of Waterloo, WISE, and IC3 collectively understand that climate change action and energy transitions can't occur without Indigenous rights and reconciliation at the forefront. And we're actively continuing to learn about our responsibilities here. So I encourage all of you as audience members and panelists to get to know whose land you live on and to consider the ways that you might personally disrupt the ongoing legacy of colonialism. There's more information that's really helpful and enlightening at native-land.ca if you'd like to learn more about that. So a quick note on sort of how we're going to proceed with the next hour and a bit, hour and a half. I'd just like to encourage the audience to use the chat function to enter your questions as we go. They'll be collected by our excellent team at WISE and IC3, passed along to me, and I'll share them with the panelists at the end. So that's how we're going to proceed with questions as we go. And I hope we'll have plenty of time for that after all of the presenters get their time to talk. So Let's begin with Angela Carter. Welcome. Angela Carter is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Her research has focused on environmental policy and politics surrounding oil extraction in Canada's major oil producing provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador. She has analyzed how environmental policy is developed and contested, emphasizing tensions between environmental and community impacts and economic imperatives. Angela is now extending this work in an international comparative project on supply-side climate policy, focusing on political conditions necessary to wind down fossil fuel extraction in developed world states. She's particularly intrigued by the rise of keep it in the ground movements and legislation. And with that, I'll pass it to Angela. Thank you, Dr. Carter.
All right, thank you for having me. And I wish I could be there with you all to hear about your interest in your work. And I hope you're keeping safe. I know for many students, especially those of you who are actually on Waterloo's campus, this is a disrupted time. So I hope you're getting at least some of the support that you need. I hope you're okay out there. I've been asked to address 2 points. So next, Natalie, if you could move those slides forward for me, thank you. The first point is, what's the most important thing that Canada could do to help move the needle? And my answer is, well, I think it's citizens collectively pressuring governments to begin a phase out of oil and gas production. So over the next couple of minutes, I'd like to tell you why I think that's so, and then what we can do next as an action item. So next. You wouldn't be here today, I know, if you didn't know about the astounding challenge that we are faced with. We need to enact deep emission reductions. And that's going to require nothing less than fundamental changes to our energy systems and arguably to our political economic systems, and maybe even the notions of what it means for us to live a good life, as individuals and in our communities. Next. To date, the global effort to confront the climate crisis has focused on the demand side, or the end of pipe. So using measures like pricing carbon, and even how we account for emissions internationally through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change doesn't put the focus on the source of emissions. But as I'm showing here, fossil fuels account for nearly 78% of all emissions that are driving along the climate crisis. So that's the source of one of the major sources of the problem here. And that, I think, is where we need to focus our attention more. Next, please. So what's the story in Canada? We've had 30 years of making and then missing targets that were admittedly inadequate to getting to Canada's share of the problem. And today, we are the only country in the G7 that's surpassing our 1990 emissions levels. We're the only country in the G7 to be increasing emissions in the last decade. Next. So the explanation for this lies in great part, the explanation for Canada's laggardness, if you will, in global climate action, lies with the oil and gas sector and the prominence that it has in our country. Oil and gas emissions are overwhelming emission reductions in other sectors, eating up far too much of what is a shrinking carbon budget, especially as we amp up ambition and move to deeper targets for 2030, and then adding a 2050 target as well. Next. So this problem, the oil and gas sector emissions problem in Canada, is going to get worse. Last November, knowing everything that it knows about Canada's climate commitments, the Canada Energy Regulator projected that our oil and gas production was going to grow from 2020 to 2050. Oil production is expected to peak only in 2039. And by 2050, Canada is anticipated to be producing more oil than we did before the pandemic. Now, 2050, of course, is an important year because that's, of course, the year that we're supposed to be at net zero emissions. Next, that was okay, Natalie. It was good timing, actually. So based on Hughes data, so David Hughes, looking at the evolving scenario that the Canada Energy Regulator produced, He's showing us that by 2050, so if you look at the bottom right-hand corner there, when we're supposed to be now with these new targets at net zero, given the oil and gas sector, we're going to have 200 megatons per year of CO2 equivalent. So obviously we have a contradiction here in terms. Next. So what's needed? In my mind, it's clear that Canada needs to begin winding down and phasing out oil and gas production to align with those 1.5 degree imperatives for climate. There are roadmaps available to us. And the example that I'm showing you here is from the Production Gap Report, which is a UN-backed report with international research institutes that are showing what countries need to do, what we need as a global community to do as well to get to climate safety. And that means bringing down, bending the curve, not just of emissions, but the fossil fuel sector that is driving those along. Next. So point two, what is it that we can do? My answer to this question is to join the movement pressing for that wind down. So why should we do that and how should we do that? So let me just say a couple of things about that. Next, please, Natalie. So some people will say that solving the climate crisis is up to individuals acting alone. And it's ironic that oil companies are one of the groups that will encourage this sort of focus. They're telling us, as in this example here from British Petroleum, to ride a bike or to eat less red meat. Next. But the barriers to solving the climate crisis are too high for individuals acting alone. The world's largest oil companies have worked for decades, knowing everything that they knew in-house about the climate crisis, but they still worked for decades to block climate action. Our largest banks in this country are invested in the industry, and so are interested in seeing it prosper and seeing it grow. Our governments have been convinced by a strong pro-fossil fuel lobby and by the oil and gas producing provinces in our country that we can have both. We can ride two horses, as you see this cartoon here, Trudeau riding the horse of expanding oil and gas extraction and also bold climate action. Next, thanks. Now, don't get me wrong, individual actions do matter, and I think that they're essential. And here's a list of some of my favorite things that we all can do. Everything from consuming less and eating differently, choosing to divest our personal finances, not banking with the bad guys, and talking about the climate crisis with people in our community so that we can build up information and goodwill and action, demanding change and so forth. But next. But we need collective action in order to match the scale of the problem and to confront those who are standing in the way of change. So one method that I think that's really helpful to think about this is practicing active hope. Next, please, Natalie. So active hope is basically, it's 3 steps. The first step is to see clearly, to understand the predicament that we're in and why it's happening, but also taking a moment to grieve. This is a scary time, especially for young people, and I think we need to be able to take a moment to reflect on what this means for our life and take some time for that. Second step of active hope is envisioning what we want instead, imagining what the world looks like when we win climate justice. And then the third is joining with others to make that happen, right? So doing the imaginative creative work and then actually going out to work with others to create it. Why collective action? Actually, not yet, Natalie. Why collective action? 2 reasons. Collective action works. People coming together to demand change gives politicians the incentives and the permission that they need to act. People power is blocking or slowing down projects that would lock us into greater emissions. In the meantime, the collective action that we undertake is raising awareness in the general population. It's growing the movement and growing its power. Women's suffrage, civil rights, most major social changes required big collective action. It works, and we need to do that here with climate justice. Second reason for collective action is that there are some personal benefits to doing this. Believing that we have to solve this problem by acting alone and believing that we're to blame, and yet really knowing that as individuals we're ultimately powerless, that is deeply disempowering, and it makes us check out, bury our heads, discount the problem. But if we act collectively with solidarity, if we figure out who is really to blame and we challenge that power, well, that's empowering. And suddenly we're part of the greatest task of our time, and we're making connections in our community, we're making art, we're sharing food, we're imagining a better future, and then we're getting together to make it so. Collective climate action makes our lives better. So not only is it effective, but it feels really good. Next. And throughout all of that work, we need to pay close attention to the leadership of Indigenous peoples and communities who have long opposed fossil fuel development on our lands and demonstrated, really shown how to create climate justice, what a climate safe future and a climate just future looks like, even while they've carried the heaviest burden for the crisis. And here is a picture of one of my heroes, the person in blue, Melina Labucan Massimo, who is leading the way with one of her, she's got a business and a social organization that's doing exactly this. It's really exciting work. And so reconciliation is climate justice, land back movements are climate justice, collective climate action has got to foreground this. Thankfully, next, this is happening in Waterloo region. So there's two ways, and I'll leave you with this, that you can get involved and join this movement that I'm talking to you about today. In the Waterloo region, you can check out the 50 by 30 movement. So this is a big climate justice coalition that is developing in the region now and pushing for change. Very exciting and beautiful people involved with this initiative. On University of Waterloo's campuses, I'd encourage people to connect with the fossil-free UW, U-Waterloo movement. So these are the students that have been pushing for divestment, for example, but also some anti-racist work that is moving the needle on the climate crisis issue here in Kitchener-Waterloo. So both of these are great places to learn and connect and participate in making the changes that we need to solve the climate crisis. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope we can talk soon.
Thanks, Angela. That was excellent and really helpful. What I particularly appreciate is the way that you can tell this kind of complex story between the links between individual and collective action, while sort of giving both their due and sort of tracing that cycle. I think that's really quite powerful, and I really appreciate the sort of specific advice for how to engage here locally. And to that, as the moderator's prerogative, I would say part of engaging in collective behavior change is voting as well. So whenever we have the chance, that's a really important opportunity for our voices to be heard. So I hope there's room at the end of our panel to discuss this in more detail. I think there's a lot there to explore. Thanks very much. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next speaker, Royden Fraser. Royden Fraser is a professor in the Department of Mechanical and Mechatronics Engineering at the University of Waterloo, where he also co-supervises the University of Waterloo Alternative Fuels team. His research interests include alternative fuels and hybrid electric vehicles, exergy analysis of energy conversion systems, thermodynamics of ecosystems, and emissions impacts, both local and regional. So with that, thanks, Royden. I'll pass it to you.
Well, thank you, Sarah. So this talk is going to be sort of more of the, how are we going to get this reduction in fossil fuels? So we're going to take a look at the solution of solar and wind, which is often proposed as the way to obtain our energy to replace the fossil fuels. Next slide. So what I'd like to do to start us off here is have everyone participate in answering the question that I'll post in a moment. But before we answer the question, you need to set yourself up. So you need to open up your chat and make sure that the two in your chat is changed from panelist to all panelists and attendees. So please make that change in chat. And then what I'm going to ask is in 1 to 4 words, very short, answer the question I'm going to post in a moment. All right, so next slide. So the question is, what is our biggest challenge to replacing fossil fuels with wind and solar to the best of your understanding today. And I will read some of the answers in the chat. I'll just wait for some to pop up. Please. Or is this too hard of a question? It's interesting. Subsidies for the oil and gas industries instead of for renewables. That's certainly a big challenge. No big companies heading the shift, right? Companies, if they head the shift, it sort of gives it an economic drive. What's the biggest challenge here? Well, I think I'll just leave it at that. It's interesting. It's not that obvious, right? There's not like a single answer coming out. Yet this is the solution. It's the solution, but we don't know what the challenge is. So I'm hopefully going to discuss what the challenge is with replacing fossil fuels with wind and solar. Next slide. So if we take a look at the Bruntland Report, and the Bruntland Report is where the sustainable development was defined as meeting the needs of the present while not compromising the needs of the future generations. That's classical definition in 1987. If you actually read this report, it boils down to two things. It's what do you want and what can you get? And there's several wants we have, but I'm going to just focus on the one. So the want we're going to look at is to replace fossil fuels with renewable, solar, and wind. And what I'm going to try to do now is talk about the technical side of what can we actually get. And to understand that, how we can do this or what we can actually achieve, we need to understand the problem first. Next slide. So the first thing I want to do is just put to rest that there's no silver bullet. Even solar and wind have their issues. You see here disposal of wind turbine blades in Casper, Wyoming. They're basically being buried. These wind turbine blades are larger and heavier than the wings on a Boeing 747. We have just begun to see the impact of this disposal of wind turbines. They're made out of carbon fiber. They're not recyclable. They're just going to turn into landfill. And we're on an exponential growth of wind usage. Wind turbines last about 25 years. We've only had a couple thousand now that have been retired. In the next 5 years, 12,000 in Europe retired. Then it's going to be 40,000 in 5 years. It's going to increase extremely fast, and we're just burying them. In fact, the amount of garbage or disposal of these wind turbines is going to dwarf landfills today. So just saying, it's not a perfect solution. And if we take a look at solar, these are a picture of two wind farms in Ontario. These are wind farms. They're economically viable, but they've taken up farmland. Is that a good use of land? And if they're not taking up farmland, they're going to take up some ecological system land and affect the ecology. It's still going to have an effect. And that doesn't even take into account the toxicity that comes along with the production and the waste problem. Next slide. So anyway, we're still hopeful that we can replace fossil fuels with wind and solar. Take a look at this graph. This is similar to what some of the material that Angela was presenting. What we have here is the per capita energy distribution. So if you take a look at a person in the world, this is for the world, and where the energy comes from for them to go about their daily activities, this tells you the proportion on average that is from coal, oil, gas, and renewables. And take a look at the renewables. It's down around 10%. That little red dot is 15%. That's the highest number for primary energy I've been able to find in reports for today in 2020. And I'll just call that optimistic. But even take that red dot and you go back to 1850, and it's basically the same amount per capita of renewables today that we were doing in 1850 in terms of our energy. And the one way you could summarize this graph is to say all of our standard of living improvements since 1850 have been due to non-renewables. That's a lot. And it also means of that renewables there, only about 5% or less is due to wind and solar. Most of it is hydro and biomass. So you need at least 20 times as much wind and solar energy. So don't forget about that impact I just talked about, but you need about 20 times. Next slide. And then you have, and I thank Angela for presenting this similar graph on the upper right-hand side here. This is just the carbon emissions in Canada and the expectations to reach net zero by 2050. That's the black line going down to the right in the upper right-hand side, or meeting the Paris Agreement there in 2030, and the other dots shown on the way down. And then I have a red line there. What's that red line? Well, that red line relates to the graph in the lower right, left-hand side. And this is the engineering side of things, where you go from scientific idea or the concept through engineering feasibility, commercial feasibility, utility integration, and then you get significant use. And I'm talking 5% of our energy would be significant use. That time frame on nuclear is the fastest any energy system has ever been developed. And that's a 40-year slope, 40 years. And so that red line is a 40-year slope. So we have to actually do better and faster than nuclear development. And nuclear development was driven by an enormous military budget behind it. And we need that. That's an awful lot to ask. But that's the situation we're at. Next slide. The good news, so that was the depressing news. The good news is the solar energy striking the Earth is about 5,000 times the amount of energy we consume as humans. So there's plenty of it. And wind energy is a form of solar energy. So wind and solar come from the same source. That's 5,000 times. Now, had this been 25 years ago, I would have said 10,000 times. Because the other thing you have to realize is the amount of energy we consume doubles about every 25 years. About the age of people watching this that are in university for 20, 25 years, you can imagine that all the energy you've consumed in your lifetime equals, and this is a fact, all the energy ever consumed since 1800. And the next 20 years will be all the energy consumed up to today in the next 25 years. Big challenge, a lot of energy to replace. Next slide, please. So let's take a look now at how we do the replacement. This is for Ontario, day in October last year. The green is the wind energy, the blue is the natural gas, the base load, the brown at the bottom, right? The thing here to note is you have your daily fluctuations, so you see your 7 days, but you have this sort of huge amount of energy underneath, this base load, this huge square or rectangular region where you need a constant supply of energy, not that fluctuating wind energy. That fluctuating wind energy is actually a problem. Next slide. What type of problem is it? Well, in 2016, we actually paid $1 billion not to make wind. We turned the windmills off. Furthermore, we sold enough energy to power 2 million homes at prices below how much it cost to produce the energy, because we were producing excess wind in the province. And we do not allow new wind farms in the province. So there's a limit. The limit is you cannot have more than about 20–25% of your electricity grid being wind. It's just the limit because of the fluctuation. Impossible. So how are you going to make up the other 80%? Where's it going to come from if it's not solar and wind and you don't want fossil fuels? Next slide. Well, the thing we've got to realize, it's not a cost issue. Wind is the cheapest. There's many reports about the cost of nuclear, oil, gas, but wind, on-land wind, is actually the cheapest per megawatt. So what's the big problem? So let's show the answer. Energy storage. And that's what I was looking for at the beginning. Energy storage. That's the only way to solve and replace that large amount of base load energy we need. Next slide. And this just shows there's only 4 ways to do that. Pumped hydro, this is the upper right-hand side. You got to have large power, large energy. This is a power versus energy graph. You got pumped hydro, compressed air energy storage, hydrogen, or synthetic natural gas. Next slide. So, wow, the storage problem facing us is large scale for wind and solar, and it's huge. So now I'm just going to say, what can you do? Last slide, next slide. 2 things. One thing I didn't talk about was distributed energy, and that's where you can help. And if you buy an electric car and our utilities invest in vehicle to grid and grid to vehicle so that it becomes sort of a local storage system, we can increase that storage very rapidly. And I also put a fuel cell car down there because that supports hydrogen. So buying these electrified cars is what you can do. And the second thing I put down here, and this is important, these things don't happen just for economic reasons. They need often regulatory drivers. So do support politicians who recognize and support energy storage. And thank you. That's where I will finish off and leave you thinking.
Great. Thanks, Royden. That was excellent. I am always fascinated to kind of, from an engineering perspective, be helped along the process of kind of peeling back the layers to the heart of the technical challenge. I so often focus on the governance and behavioral challenges, but those the technical core of it all is so important to keep in mind. And also, you know, that I think both Angela and Royden have really helped to communicate the urgency and the scale of the challenge. You know, as I was sort of going over some of my notes for this webinar, it occurred to me that I may very well be wearing the jeans I'm wearing right now in 2030, much less, you know, the house that I live in and the infrastructure that supports my city. So it's remarkable the scale of what needs to transform in the next decade and onward to sort of reach these ambitious reductions that we're proposing. Okay, thanks very much. Let's move on to our next two presenters who are going to be a tag team for us today. We have Tova Davidson and Mary Jane Patterson with us. Tova Davidson is the Executive Director of Sustainable Waterloo Region. Many of you may be familiar with SWR, which is a social enterprise nonprofit that helps the local business community and Waterloo Region become more environmentally and economically sustainable. I work really closely with Tova through our Transform project. So I've gotten to know a lot more about her approach to this work in the region. And one thing I will say about both Tova and Mary Jane is that they're sort of looked to in this region as this incredible source of inspiration and energy and really specific, actionable steps that we can all take. And Tova brings to this work a background in marketing, communications, and business, so she's really well placed to support the small and medium-sized enterprises and region and municipalities in the process. So welcome, Tova. Mary Jane Patterson is the Executive Director for REAP Green Solutions, which is an environmental charity that has been helping people in Waterloo Region to live sustainably for over 20 years through programs in the areas of energy efficiency, water conservation, waste reduction, and cultivating healthy yards. Very of interest as we ease into spring every year. I think about this stuff. Mary Jane has been working with REAP to make an impact on local sustainability since its inception in 1999. And with her guidance, REAP has helped the Waterloo Region community save over 23,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, I'd like to pass it to Tova.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's my distinct pleasure to be here today with so many great people and to be co-presenting with MJ. She and I work very, very closely together on climate action. And so that's where we're going to start in our talk today, to share what's been happening with climate action and to talk specifically about Transform WR, which is Waterloo Region's long-term strategy and short-term plan to how do we make local action towards what we need to do in a provincial, federal, and global scale. And it's just so perfect, everything that's been talked about already, the things that need to happen provincially, that need to be happening federally, that need to be happening in terms of technologies to enable this. And what we are focusing on now is what can happen locally and what is possible within our local areas of control and our local actions. So next slide, please. For those that don't know, climate action is a partnership between REAP Green Solutions and Sustainable Waterloo Region. We co-lead it, but we do that in partnership with all of the regional municipalities, so including the region of Waterloo, the cities of Cambridge, Kitchener, and Waterloo, and the townships of North Dumfries, Wellesley, Wilmot, and Woolwich. And together we've been working on this long-term strategy and short-term plan. Next slide, please. This is a graph lots of you have seen many, many times, but I think it always bears sharing. This is what our short-term target was for 2020, which we still have re-inventory to do, which will be an interesting one in light of COVID. Our 2010 baseline year there shows you what our emissions were. And in 2015, we saw a 5.2% reduction in emissions, with one of the notable changes being 49% of our emissions locally produced came from transportation. That's that green box right at the bottom there. So you see that the percentage went up, and the rate of vehicle ownership in the region also doubled the rate of population growth. And that 2050 blue box is the 80% reduction where we know we need to go at very least. Next slide, please. This really is that partnership now, and funded through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. We've been working on this long-term strategy and short-term plan, and it is intended to be within the scope of what you're seeing right here. The actions that can be taken and the changes that can be made based on the abilities, the scope, the different kinds of jurisdiction, and what kind of changes we can make. So this is the scope of the work that's presented in this Transform WR. Next slide, please. So we used, and you can just forward so you can see the whole thing, we used a backcasting model. And, you know, this was talked about already in what Angela was saying. What is the future we want? And so we went out to the community and we talked to thousands of people in a variety of places, including, I had the privilege to go to two very unique ones. I went to a rodeo, never been to that before, and a Mopar event, who knew? Met all kinds of different people, and we asked them what was the vision of the future that they wanted. What did they see a low carbon future being? And we have some very clear vision and understanding that that low carbon future isn't just about the environment. Next slide, please. We talked to 900 plus community members. We talked to focus groups, in-depth interviews in that community engagement phase. We had 460 survey respondents. This really was formed by everybody, and the understanding that this was creating a just community was a really cool thing that came out of that. Next slide, please. We also talked to a lot of technical experts, because what we wanted was to say, what can we actually do here in Waterloo Region? What are the things that are within our control? What are the things that we could technically make happen? And how do we get there? Let's have the path, not just the vision. And so we talked to all of those technical experts as well. And there's just some idea of who it was that we spoke with. Next slide, please. This is actually a full wall. It looks like it's just a little piece, but it's a full wall in the consultant's office of all of the different ideas, all of the suggestions, the technical pieces that they brought together, and how did we put together this long-term strategy. And it was a room essentially full of all of the things that we collected from the community and the understanding that we built from the technical experts. Next slide. And just to end with the vision that came from it, and then I'll pass it over to Mary Jane to talk about some of the things that were included in the plan, was that we were looking at how do we integrate into the Sustainable Development Goals. Back to what's already been said, that this future we're working to build is not just about the environment and the 5 environmental UN SDGs. It's about all of them, and most importantly, the 17th, that they're all interrelated to each other. So there's been a fairly strong integration of the intentionality of this being a just transition and giving the time and space for a just transition to happen, to braid together the different perspectives and all of the people that need to be part of this future from the backcasting vision. And to that end, we've got a number of things that we've done to try to build that in, including review of the strategy from that diverse community, the BIPOC community specifically, but to ask everybody in our community to be looking at this plan, to be looking at what we can possibly do locally to reach a larger provincial, federal, and global goal. So Mary Jane, I'll pass it to you next.
All right, thanks Tova. Well, here is our trajectory. You can see doing nothing on the top, a stark black line, and how it goes up. And you can see in blue, where would industry trends take us if we left it up to the market? And then finally, you see in green the trajectory that we want to take to get to 2080, to get to 80 by 2050. And the next slide. So how do we get there? Well, what has emerged from that community visioning that Tova described is that this is not the time for incremental change. If we want to have that equitable, prosperous, resilient, low carbon community, we have to transform the way we move, the way we build and live in our spaces, the way we produce and consume, and the way we relate, which is a way of explicitly calling out that vision of an equitable community, a hub of clean tech, the things we want to see embedded in every aspect of this plan. Next, please. Those 4 calls to action translate to 6 transformative changes that are rolling out on the page right now. And I'm going to delve into each one. So we'll carry on. I think there's one more coming up. There we go. And then let's carry on to the next slide so that we can tackle them one by one. So transformative change. Number 1, by 2050, most trips are taken using active transportation with the support of a robust public transit system. That means by active transportation, walking, cycling, or rolling. And you heard from Tova about the rate of personal vehicle ownership. We have a big challenge here. In 2015, nearly half of our emissions came from transportation, and we found that nearly half of personal trips were short distance ones of less than 5 kilometers that could be achieved with active transportation. So we need to make fewer trips, shorter trips, meaning shop locally, and lower energy trips. And public transit is critical to give people an alternative when they can't walk, cycle, or roll, and something accessible to different incomes and abilities. Next slide, please. Number 2 is pretty straightforward. The remaining personal and commercial vehicles need to be zero emission vehicles. That's probably going to be electric vehicles. There's the possibility of green hydrogen also. We're still planning that most trips will be active transportation rather than vehicles at all. Next slide. Number 3, by 2050, businesses and homes no longer use fossil fuels for space heating and cooling and water heating. 45% of our local emissions come from the energy used in buildings, and most of that is to heat the space and the water, and most of that energy is natural gas or other fossil fuels. So we have to switch off of fossil fuels for heating and cooling. I think we can see how that really ties in with what Angela was talking about, which is bringing the fossil fuel industry to an end, winding it down in Canada. And we have to address that in new buildings that we build as well as in existing buildings. Next slide, please. Number 4, by 2050, Waterloo Region uses less, wastes less, and no longer disposes organic matter in landfills. Waste has significant consequences for greenhouse gas emissions. When organic material ends up in the landfill, that breaks down into methane, and that's a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So what we're talking about here is a circular economy, using items as long as possible, extracting the maximum value from them, and recovering, repurposing, regenerating at the end of their life. Next slide, please. Number 5 is that by 2050, Waterloo Region has a thriving local food system built on local farming, food production, and processing that feeds much of our community. We have a really strong agricultural community here, and it is directly impacted by a changing climate. The main sources of greenhouse gas emissions from this sector are livestock, synthetic fertilizers and manure, and associated farm machinery. 2 important ways that we can address the emissions from our food are eating more plant-based meals and reducing our food waste. And I'd add a third, shopping locally and supporting our local economy to build into that prosperous community. Next slide, please. And here's the 6th one. By 2050, Waterloo Region has leveraged reducing greenhouse gas emissions to increase prosperity, equality, and resilience for all. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build the community that we want. That came through really strongly in our community consultation. And the strategies in this particular change form the backbone for all of the work in the rest of the plan. Prioritizing increasing equity through our planning, positioning Waterloo Region as a clean tech hub, and ramping up local energy production, local renewable energy as part of that. Supporting a greenhouse gas reduction transition plan for all organizations and households, and advocacy at senior levels of government. Next slide, please. To get to this 2050 goal, the next 10 years are crucial. We know from the science that change cannot wait. We have to move quickly to implementation and make real change by 2030. We've defined an interim target of a 30% reduction by 2030, and you see what we're proposing here in this slide spelled out here. This was informed not only by taking action and reducing emissions right away, but also by positioning us to lay a solid foundation for our long-term target by 2050. This is systems change that we're talking about, so we need planning to put these systems, to create these new systems. So a question that we're hearing is, could we make this a 50% target or a 50% reduction by 2030? And the answer is we could, with support from the federal and provincial governments. This plan is built on local action. To go further, we need action from the federal and provincial governments. Policies, legislation, and substantial financial incentives and supports. We need all hands on deck for this. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of this right now that you could add your voice to. Number one, our electricity system is intending to add more fossil fuels in the next few years as the Pickering nuclear plant is taken off for refurbishment. This is going to blow all our climate action plans out of the water. And the campaign on this is being led by the Ontario Clean Air Alliance. They've got a lot of great information on their website. Secondly, efficiencycanada.org is a great hub for something else we really need to see from our senior governments. We need a national low-income energy efficiency program. We have needed this for a long time. Equity is a linchpin in this climate action plan, and everyone deserves a chance to have a more energy efficient, affordable, comfortable home. Those are just two examples of the kind of support we're going to need from federal and provincial governments if we want to make rapid systems change here. Next slide, please. So this climate action plan is ready for your feedback on Engage WR. It will be up until Monday. And my action item is to encourage everyone to go there, read the strategy, and see where you fit in. Look at what we're proposing to do. This change of 30% by 2030 and 80 by 2050 is ambitious for our community. We would love to hear your feedback. And I want to say that it's an inspiring read to hear that vision of the community that came through to us, to see the principles we're going to be basing this on, and all the action that we're going to be doing together. This is going to need all of us rolling up our sleeves. And I think if we do, we really can make a more equitable, prosperous, and resilient community together. The next slide shows you the dates for final consultation is ending on Monday. And then this plan will be coming to all 8 municipalities in Waterloo Region in June for endorsement. And that's all for us.
Thanks very much, Tova and Mary Jane. That was excellent. I really appreciate the focus that you both placed on the vision itself, what makes up that vision, and making sure that we understand that this isn't just an environmental issue. It's an environmental and social and technical and political challenge. And by casting the net wide that way, I think we actually open up a really important conversation about all of the other transformations that we want to see in our community, not just a dramatic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, although that's the one that we're focusing on today. And also the scales of governance challenge. I hope we come back to that, how important it is for us all to be pulling in the same direction from municipal governments on up. We tend to put pressure on the level of government that we have the closest relationship to, and not all of the power rests at that level of government. So understanding where power lies and putting pressure where it's due, I think is really crucial. So thanks. We'll come back around to all of this. Great. So last but certainly not least, I'm thrilled to introduce Jordan Lynn. Jordan is a third-year mechanical engineering student who's passionate about sustainable development. He is the co-founder of Impact Alliance at the University of Waterloo, which aims to mobilize SDG knowledge and deliver engagement opportunities that bring all levels of campus together. He recently co-founded the registered nonprofit Reimagine 17, which is a national community working to amplify youth action on the SDGs. Jordan's passion has also led him to take part in co-op terms with a Solar Solutions Research and Development Institute in Tanzania, as well as the University of Waterloo Sustainability Office. So thanks for being with us here today, Jordan, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'd like to start off with two numbers, 51 billion and 0. 51 billion is the amount of tons of carbon dioxide greenhouse gases that our world emits every year, and net zero is what we need to achieve. This is possible, and I'm going to touch on two solution areas where we can contribute. But first, let's take a look at some of the issues. Educational institutions need to set more ambitious climate targets and accelerate their progress on climate change. I'm an engineer, so yes, I like data, and let me lead you through some of the data I crunched yesterday. Next slide, please. The SDG Accord is the education sector's response to the UN SDGs. Its global climate letter is a commitment that post-secondary institutions can sign by agreeing to mobilize resources for climate change research, to make a pledge for carbon neutrality by 2030 or 2050 at the latest, and to increase the delivery of sustainability education across curricula, campus, and community programs. Now, there are 321 signatories, 28 of which are Canadian. Over a half have set carbon neutrality targets by 2030 or earlier, while just a few have set a 2050 goal. This is 19%. In Canada, 28 only makes up 12% of our post-secondary institutions. We have about over 200 of these. Out of that, 10 have set carbon neutrality targets by 2040 or earlier, while 11 have settled on 2050. The remaining signatories have no known targets. And the only university in Canada that is actually already carbon neutral is Laval University, and they've been net neutral since 2015. So they get a special shout out from me. We can look at other agreements or platforms, but this gives us an idea of the gap. Now, what do you think our university's carbon neutral target is? 2050. Now, I'm not here to present negative points about our shift neutral plan because at its foundation, the plan is a great framework with a clear 46 initiatives laid out. What I want you to think is what 2050 says about a university that prides itself in thinking beyond innovation. I actually did my co-op with the amazing team at our sustainability office last fall and had the chance to contribute to the many programs and backhand work being done to advance campus sustainability. So what does our progress look like right now? Well, we've actually had an increase of 8% in GHG emissions and have yet to reach the 17.5 reduction we set out for 2025. Now, the question is, how do we improve campus climate action and accelerate progress? We need to actively engage with the programs and feedback mechanisms at our university. Let me present to you 3 ways you can do this. One is to engage through surveys, town halls, and campus consultations. The feedback gathered in these mechanisms go directly to decision makers and gives them an idea of what our campus community cares about. So the next time you see an email on the campus strategic plan or a WUSA consultation, don't delete it, but share your voice instead. For students, there are many clubs and initiatives you can join. I'll put out a shameless plug for my group called the Impact Alliance. As was mentioned by Sarah, we provide SDG programs and events, so follow our Instagram for news. There are also many other groups, and a list can be found on the Sustainability Office's website. For staff and faculty, the Green Office program is a great way to engage with sustainability at work, and the development of a Green Labs program is on its way. Having said all this about post-secondary institutions and what we can do about climate action, there's another key aspect that goes hand in hand, and that is taking action on a more personal level. Next slide, please. We need to integrate more sustainable living habits in our lives and speak with our money. Now, saying something's easy, but doing it is another story. I could easily tell my project team that I'll have my part of the report complete when it's due on Friday, but not actually finish it until the last minute. This would obviously cause trouble to the team and make me a bad team member. But the thing with climate changes is that the deadline has already passed, and each one of us on this planet has to step up. Now, there are two fronts to this. One issue is that large corporations and heavy emitters are releasing copious amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But who do these groups serve? Us, the consumer population. And having watched some of the earlier speakers present, like Angela, about the issues that these big companies are creating, that's like an important piece. There's also the piece of our action, our personal action. And it's important to have this public discourse and about maybe what best strategy to go with. But in the end, it's the point of just taking this action to make a better change. So we can't solely petition that these groups reduce their emissions if our actions say the opposite. What we can do as a collective is use our purchasing power when we buy or choose not to buy consumer goods. This means keeping that sweater for another year, choosing chicken over beef, or going with an electric car. We're not buying one at all. And I understand it's hard, like even for myself as a student, it's often hard to connect single personal action to a scaled global impact. But I like to think of it through this analogy. Our elected leaders are really our elected followers, because when each of us votes, they listen. So by voting with our money, we send a signal that sustainability matters. Now, let me share some examples of my sustainable living habits. As a student who loves bubble tea and sustainability, I've been using a reusable container whenever I make a bubble tea run. You can find these online or even at Zero Waste Bulk in Uptown Waterloo. This is like how Tova and MJ talked about supporting local. Another habit of mine was inspired in my co-op term with the Solar R&D Institute in Tanzania. While I was there on June 1st, 2019, plastic bags were banned. So I had to start phasing them out. And actually, I was soon not reliant on them. And after that summer, I switched to reusable produce bags, which I bring on my grocery trips. And even though it took a few weeks to remember and get used to, now it's something that sticks with me. So I understand I've laid out several actions over the course of my presentation, and by no means do you have to commit to all of them, or even a few, because that's not how habits develop. You just have to start with one if you haven't already, maintain it, and then commit to adding more actions. And if you're ready to take it up and can consistently dedicate your time to some of these actions, whether it's engaging with our region's strategies or with the university or on a personal level, because that's a lot to handle. We're all busy. It's easy to start with one and make that consistent. And then from there, tangible outcomes will follow. So in closing, I brought these focus areas into perspective, assuming everyone attending this webinar will take action. I cannot stress the urgency enough. We're out of time. So change will happen if we, the people, enact this change. And if we do, then climate change will change for the better. Thank you very much. Next slide. So these are some resources I would be glad to send after or in the chat of places you can go. So right at this moment, you can look at some of these links for action at the university. We're going to be moving to an activity about a poll right now. So Natalie. So what we want to do is present to you 5 different action items that you can take and commit to. I like to think from my experience, going to different conferences or attending webinars like these, it's hard to commit to something, or sometimes it just becomes passive action if we don't follow up, because that's where it is important. We learn and then we take this, commit to it, and make action. So what I want you to do right now is vote on just a single one of these poll items, and we'll see what the results come up. So as you put your answers through, I'll just read through these options One of them is I will actively engage in sustainability issues at my university and through my personal daily habits. The second, I will review the climate action Waterloo Region strategy on Engage Waterloo Region before Monday and give my feedback on how our community can implement the actions and achieve our targets. The third, I can commit to making every trip under 5 kilometers a sustainable trip. The fourth, I will join the movement by signing up at Fossil Free U Waterloo and by 50 by 30. And last but not least, I will buy electric, hybrid, or fuel cell cars, even if it costs a little more, and support politicians who support energy storage. So I'll just give a few seconds to a minute for everyone to put in their answers. So as you are putting in your answers, one thing I would suggest, if you've already put it in, is also, if you can, write on like a physical piece of paper in front of you or somewhere physical this commitment. I find it's much easier to commit to it on paper, have it in a physical place in your space rather than putting it on digitally, because sometimes we forget that. So that's a bonus step if you've already finished with your poll. All right, so we have the results now, and we can see everyone likes my option the best. So that's a plus for me. But let's see what these mean. So we have the one about engaging at sustainability issues in my university and personal habits. This does make sense. I believe the audience comes from students, undergraduate, and graduate at our university, as well as staff and faculty. So this is like a great way through some of the links that were shared to engage. We also have the second one for reviewing the strategy. It's like another important part about engaging with our municipalities, because like I mentioned earlier, filling out these surveys may seem tedious, but this is information, concrete raw data that goes to decision makers. And okay, so we have making a trip under 5 kilometers a sustainable trip. I'm glad to see this is not the last, because I was thinking in the COVID pandemic, when we're not really going out, you know, is this much of an option? So that's good to see. And then the following two about supporting the fossil free movement, as well as going electric. So I think these are some good options, and I really urge everyone to commit to these, really bring them into place in your routine. And thank you for your time there. I'll pass it to Sarah now.
Thanks so much, Jordan. That was great. And so interesting to see which actions kind of resonate most with those who are here as audience members and participants. So that was really great. And I also reflect, you know, as you're sort of giving this call to action for both students and faculty and staff to kind of engage in the university as a space for transformation. I've often thought, having spent as many years in universities as I have, why it is that this isn't, you know, doesn't jump to mind often as a really important pathway for change. And I mean, I don't have an answer to that question, except that, you know, I think faculty, you know, too often we're trained to do research that's outward looking, that, you know, focuses on other places or other people elsewhere, rather than our own institution looking inward to what we can transform here. And likewise with students, you know, there's a relatively short period of their life, you know, during which they're here at the University of Waterloo. So it can seem like a transient experience for some. So I think the, you know, the pathways that you suggest are a really important opportunity for us all to reflect on this really large and important institution that we're a part of and transform it from within. So that's pretty cool. Thanks very much. Okay, so if everybody else on the panel could turn on their videos, actually, we're going to move to the question and answer portion of our afternoon together. Thanks, hello, nice to see your faces again. And we have some great questions rolling in, and I'm going to blend a couple together and sort of reframe it slightly so that we can deal with a multifaceted question at once, and then move on to the others as well. So you can all see the Q&A, I think. So we have several questions that focus on the targets that we're setting regionally. And there's a couple of different aspects to those questions that I'd like to pose to the panel as a whole, and we'll see if we can kind of work it out. So the first part of that question focuses on the benefits to our region if we drive towards a 50% reduction by 2030 rather than the 30% by 30. So let's focus just really carefully on that specific part of the question first. What are the benefits to us as a region of moving from a 30% by 2030 to a 50% by 2030? And then there's a second part to that target question that I'll get back to in a sec. So whoever would like to jump in with some reaction to that or answer would be great. Tova.
I'll start. I think a lot of these were aimed at MJ and I, and specifically the local climate action plan. So let's start local, and hopefully we can grow up for the impact of what we're hoping to accomplish. I think in terms of benefits, that was pretty clearly articulated by the community vision. Things like a more equitable and just community, because we will have transformed our energy systems to be one that does not reinforce people's privilege, or cleaner water, cleaner air, things like that, more green spaces. Even, you know, the action that I was suggesting of making your trips more sustainable means that you're more connected to your community. You're seeing the people in your neighborhood. You're smiling at people on the LRT. It means you've got a better and stronger sense of belonging. The other thing is that if we actually are going to transform this region to a truly sustainable region, it has to include economic, and there is huge benefit that could come to this region to think of ourselves as a clean tech innovation hub and a clean economy innovation hub beyond just how do we live and operate here as citizens, that we could actually transform our economy. And there's a huge $3 trillion industry that we could tap into. And having real ambitious local action that feeds into this and showing that we are demonstrating our commitment to it is a really important one. And I just wanted to, before I pass the baton to someone else, just to do a bit of potential reframing for the climate action plan. A lot of the questions, and I saw a bunch of them coming up, talked about a local target of 50%. And what I would like to reframe this as a local action plan that takes us to 30%, requiring the other levels of government and the other areas of influence to be part of the solution to get us to where science says we need to be. But this plan is intended to be, what can we actually do here? What control do we have here? So just to reframe it a little bit that way, to think of it that way, because that's the intention and that's what the plan does when you fill it all the way through.
Other reflections on that question? Mary Jane or Angela, Royden?
Yeah, I might be a little more of a pragmatist here. I think the benefit of it, it sets a vision. It's not necessarily we're going to reach it. I find it very difficult to see us reaching it locally. And if we do reach it locally, there's going to be other places that can't. It's just that I do see the benefit of being the leader, a healthier environment locally. And it's a vision. And if we don't have that vision, we're in trouble. I'll give an example. If you hear that it's a warm winter, a warm day in January or February, how many radio stations say, "Oh darn, this is really bad," right? They don't, because they don't have the vision that there's a problem. And so we got to have that vision that there's actually a target, a problem, and something to deal with. And that would be, to me, the biggest benefit, is getting the whole mindset to change.
So I think another kind of layer onto that question about the target or the action plan is with whom does responsibility lie to set that more ambitious target? And is it up to us locally to set the target and bring along or sort of send the signal to the higher levels of government? Or is it a very pragmatic focus on, this is exactly what we know we have control over, and so we're calling on, you know, higher levels of government to play the cards that they need to play to get us to this more ambitious target as well? Any reflections on that from a governance perspective? I'm looking at you, Angela, possibly.
It's hard to tell who's looking at who. Sorry, I didn't know I was being outed. No, well, I absolutely agree that we need to. I mean, I think as you folks saw in my presentation, that think about the largest sources of emissions and then where those are coming from. And as I look at the data that we're submitting to the United Nations, for me, I'm seeing the oil and gas sector and transportation sector, so how do we get at those to really bend that curve? And a lot of those cards are held by Alberta, the oil and gas sector. And so the hard work and obviously this is very political and it's very difficult for the federal government, but it's about trying to exert pressure on that industry in all the ways that it might have. It doesn't have all the levers, but it has some of the levers. And I think the municipal work and the provincial work is extremely important in terms of giving permission to the federal government to set those bold, ambitious targets and actually meet them. If the federal government knows that the provinces are inside and local people, as expressed through their municipalities, are on side, well, that's what politicians are looking for, right? That's they're looking for that groundswell, and we can give that to them through the municipalities in part.
Right. Thank you for that. That's great. Yeah, I think I think we're having a complex conversation here, which is really fascinating to me, at least, about the scientific foundations of understanding what various emissions levels will lead to in terms of impacts, but then the deeply political decision about what level of impacts we're willing to suffer. Because that is not science, that's politics. And it's a social question, right? So I think both of those realities need to be held simultaneously. We make decisions every day about who bears what costs of our various development decisions and over what time frame. Royden, you had a comment there?
Yeah, I just want to make sure it's technically easy. The 50% reduction is technically easy. Don't buy a car, get rid of your cell phone. We can do it. But it's not a political decision. That is a personal decision. A lot of this goes down to personal decisions of what you think is a part of your standard of living. And if you want to maintain your standard of living, energy is the price you pay. Energy and standard of living, GDP go hand in hand. And so given that strong correlation between standard of living and energy, you have to have an energy substitute. And the only substitutes that are possible at large scale are going to be solar, wind, and nuclear. And if you're not in favor of nuclear, you got solar and wind, you have to have storage, no storage, none of this is going to go anywhere deeply. So it goes back to why that topic I raised was so important. And we only have 10 years to 2030. Cars are on the road. Let's just do transportation. That's 1/3 of your energy emissions, mainly oil. 1/3 of your energy, and a lot of your carbon dioxide comes from transportation. Cars last 10 years. So you've got to be selling, and we only sell about 1 in 1,000 cars today are electric, zero emission. We would have to sell up around 80% of all cars next year, all electric, to hit that emissions target for 2030. So I say the vision's important. The technicalities are going to get in the way, but that should not stop the vision, because eventually there will be a tipping point, and that tipping point has to come as soon as it can.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish we could peel back some layers there on standard of living versus quality of life, but maybe we'll talk more about that later. Angela, you had your hand up, and I saw Jordan's hand up as well. So Angela, maybe we could kick it over to you if you still have a contribution there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would love to sort of have a detailed conversation with you, Royden, about that exact question of standard of living. And I think part of what we need to do is, and this is the cultural piece, right? So the folks in the humanities have a huge contribution to make here, which is to think about how do we imagine what a good life is?
Yeah.
And how do we rethink that in terms of now the energy constraints that we have to face? So like, for example, and I think COVID has really shown this to us, right? People in our community who are wealthy enough to be able to, fly down south for a vacation in the winter, that is very energy intensive, very emissions intensive. Well, a lot of people couldn't do that this year because of COVID. What did they discover? Maybe they discovered that they had to do things, within their communities. If they could travel, It's about, staycations, staying closer within their communities, discovering what's right there in the local area. And I would wager, because some of this I felt in my own life, not being able to sort of jet off to conferences like I normally would. I have more time because I'm traveling less, and it's actually less expensive. So I have resources that I can use for other things. I feel better about just staying within, my local community or my province for pleasure. So I think that and that's just one example of where we have a notion of what a good life is that isn't emissions safe or isn't climate safe. But I think we can start flipping and challenging. And Mary Jane had some excellent examples, and I see her out in the local community in Kitchener-Waterloo, shopping locally, and the joy that she's getting from meeting producers of her food and buying just enough of what she needs. Like there's something special about that is an augmentation of standard of life that you just can't get, or standard of living that you just can't get from getting in your vehicle and going to Costco. So I just think there's opportunity to rethink, what's a good life, what's a climate safe life, and sometimes those things intersect in beautiful ways.
And likewise, Angela, I think part of that quality of life, or the definition of a good life, perhaps part of that conversation is what responsibility do we bear to others and their quality of life and standard of living as well, not our own as well. Jordan, your hand was up. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I think this is like a very interesting, and I've seen it around kind of conversation about why aren't our governments, municipalities, or why aren't my companies setting more ambitious targets? Like, again, I'm reading this in the Q&A, and I've read it in like books or seen it in the news. There could be a whole public discourse on this. And I think I would say like 2 points to that. One is that, yeah, there won't be any target that I guess you could say would be enough to combat climate change in the time we need it to. This was very similar to, and like there's also the idea of an ambitious target versus something realistic. Economically or politically, we've seen that in the last federal election, where each party, now we're starting to see climate plans developed by each party, and how there's questions about, well, none of these are what we need to do based on science. They can say they're ambitious or they're realistic politically or economically, but in the end, it's just quick progress that we need to make. And regardless of the target, I think there's a place for us, the people that are saying we want this change. And I know you're already going out to like these strikes or making your vote or putting in these actions. We just need to keep on doing this and raising our voice to these decision makers through those mechanisms we've mentioned, so that they can keep on knowing it's important. Because again, now this is back to like the personal side of things, is rethinking, like Angela mentioned, what a good life means, or what can you kind of live without, considering like gasoline cars versus electric versus no cars if it's not required. I know this is an issue in Canada because we have a great geographical area and things are far from other locations, so that's an issue. But take it inward for personal actions as well as making those demands hand in hand, I think will add some progress to these goals.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, all of you have made some similar points that, the technology in some ways, with the perhaps major exception, Royden, of storage, many of the technologies already exist. And there's been, as a climate change researcher, I've been reading these papers for a decade and a half or more about all of the technologies necessary to get us quite far along this path. So we have to have really hard conversations about why then we haven't taken up those technologies and change the story. I think change the way we communicate about these issues and talk about those visions of the future. Royden, I have a question for you here about local energy storage. And the question is this in effect a call for the decentralization of energy distribution? And if so, could you tell us a bit more about the benefits of that decentralization?
Sure. I guess in a way it is. We're used to, but not entirely, we're used to centralized power in general in Ontario, in most of North America. But when it comes to energy storage, centralized storage is going to be very difficult. There's limited hydro. You can only have it in certain locations. Transmission lines have their losses. Same with compressed air energy storage. There's only limited locations. You have to have salt deposits generally. So up by the Sarnia area is good in Ontario, but forget Quebec, except for down maybe by the St. Lawrence area. Alberta has some, but the other provinces aren't going to be that good for compressed air. Hydrogen, that's going to take time. There's just, it's a gas, it's not a liquid, so it makes it difficult. So if we're going to have storage, we're going to have it on the large scale, but we want to have all hands on deck. And all hands on deck means we now have to start looking at decentralized storage at the same time. It's sort of like, let's maximize our efforts. It's also going to add a lot of stability to our electrical systems, which actually cannot handle a huge increase in electrical energy on our current grids without destabilization of them. And that would be a serious problem with blackouts and brownouts. So we do need distributed storage from that perspective. So I guess it has benefits to deal with the current infrastructure before it's upgraded, it has the benefits of all hands on deck, and it's in addition to what we're used to. And that's why I emphasized it. It's a different thing than we're used to. But you need both centralized and decentralized.
Great. Thanks for that elaboration. That's really helpful. Okay, let's talk a bit about public transportation. So we have a question here that is, why is public transportation an additional cost? We pay taxes to cover the cost of using roads. Why don't we cover public transit costs the same way or charge for the use of roads, parking, et cetera, just like we do for public transit? So can somebody help us understand the decision-making behind where we charge and where we put our dollars? Mary Jane, did I see your hand go up?
Well, it did until you said, can I help you understand the decision-making? I was going to say that I think it would be fantastic to have free public transit. And I think that Gina's pointing out that our taxes subsidize a more fossil fuel intensive form of transportation, and that there's a good example of a systems change that would be really great to see from federal government, for example, with a higher carbon tax that's applied to gasoline, but not applied to transit. And kind of disrupting that system could make a big difference there, I think.
Any other thoughts there? I hope we answered that question. Great. Okay. Excellent. I think we've worked through, correct me if I'm wrong, and somebody on the team can jump in, but I think we've worked through most of the questions. I realize that the questions about the you know, who steps out ahead first with a more ambitious 2030 target hasn't quite been resolved. Shockingly, it's a tough conversation without, I think, a single easy answer, but I hope we've added some nuance to that question. And I think, you know, an issue that we sort of danced around but not really talked about is sort of the global scale. Part of the reason why we're being called here in Canada to set more ambitious targets than 30 by 2030 is, of course, because of our legacy of being a high emitting country and our abundant wealth and industrialization. And so our, you know, responsibility to sort of step up as leaders there. So I think that both local and global justice lens is a really important one to keep in mind. Although I appreciate that doesn't universally resonate, you know, it might with this group, but you're here talking about climate change on a Wednesday afternoon, so we hope that this matters to you. So we have just a couple of minutes as we wrap up for the panelists. If there's anything pressing that you really would like to get off your chest before I say a few final words, we have a couple of minutes left for that. Any final thoughts or things you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I'm with Jordan. I'd really like to talk about the actions and dig into those and get started. And the actions are where the action is. That's my new motto. And I think that getting started would just, like, we're already started in a lot of ways, but getting underway and getting these kinds of transitions happening is going to feel a lot better. That's kind of to your point, Angela, about hope and really taking action ourselves and collective action together as a community.
Great. So one final sentence from everybody on the most important action, the last word on action you'd like to leave us with. Jordan, your hand was up.
I would say take action. Very simple. We already know what to do. Information's out there, regardless of what, you know, corporations or targets are. Take action, take more action, and then continue. I know it's more of us that have to take the brunt of it. Those are really passionate, but again, it makes power. Think of the vote.
Tova.
I agree with action 100% and live what you want. I also want to encourage everyone to listen. Oftentimes people get into their corners and don't really hear the perspectives. And I'll just share very quickly, I was invited to a roundtable on business and environment and happened to sit at a table. There were only 8 of us and 2 of them were full bore climate deniers. And it got very heated to the point where someone stormed out of the room. And I wanted to leave with them, but I stayed and I listened and I learned some really important things about their perspectives, about why they're operating their businesses that way, about why they are climate deniers. And it really did frame for me how to move forward talking to organizations. So we all kind of get into our way of thinking about things and can't really hear. But if you can just breathe through that moment of, oh my goodness, I can't believe they said that, and really listen, we're more likely to bring people along with us. And we need every single person to be working on this. Imperfectly, maybe, but every single person. So I encourage you to breathe and listen, and more than talk, listen and understand.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Tova. Any other final thought?
Might as well put one thought down. The way I put it is that honestly, it's not viewed as a crisis by the majority of people. It needs a behavioral change. It needs a paradigm change. It needs a major transition. And we are not going to probably get that crisis. We've only had 2 situations where energy has seriously changed. And those 2 situations are now with COVID, and that was a crisis, and you saw it. And you saw it with the oil embargo, and that was a crisis. Outside of those crises, you have not seen major impacts. And in fact, when COVID's over, you can probably expect us to go back to things as normal. So that's the problem. And so it's communicating this idea of a crisis in a time when there's not, and you do that by action. You do that by changing paradigms one at a time until there is a collective tipping point in understanding. And the news agencies no longer say, isn't this a beautiful warm day, January 1st? Right?
Right. Yeah. Yes, humans are, I think, notoriously bad at dealing with challenges that unfold over long time frames and sometimes first affect other people. But of course, we know that the effects of climate change are already global, but some bear the brunt of those impacts more than others. So I think that this is a really important note to end on, because I just want to offer a sort of reflection that we've tried to tease apart what role for the individual in acting on climate change, what that brings the individual in terms of quality of life and well-being, but what the downside of that is, perhaps feeling like either the guilt and blame of individual level action, but also that focus on individualism itself can be isolating and not in fact tackle the really deep drivers of emissions in our country, our economy and the way our cities are structured. And those are collective decisions. So, drawing that link between individual level action, the need for collective change and leadership, and then what role we have as individuals in creating pressure for that, I think is really important. And I also really appreciate that I think we've come around to a space where we acknowledge that we need to understand the underlying values and worldviews that everybody brings to this conversation, because without paying attention to that, I think we're just creating more resistance and creating more conflict and friction than perhaps is helpful in such a, with such a dramatic transformation in mind. So thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. I think we got some really tangible actions on the table, and I think we also had a really complex conversation around responsibility and change and well-being. So with that, I'd like to close our webinar today and say thank you to everybody. Please feel free to all of the attendees to reach out to any of us, I'm sure, individually through email or on social media or whatever, and we can continue the conversation. And have a lovely, sunny afternoon. Take care, stay healthy. Thanks, everyone.